Howdy everyone, today I'm looking at a camera lens that's seriously fun and pretty crazy. The Sigma 50-500mm f4.5 to 6.3 OS HSM. This lens has a massive 10 times zoom range, which ends up taking you all the way to 500mm. There's nothing remotely like it on the market today. That's a useful 50mm slightly wide angle, zooming in to a super telephoto 500mm. If you're using a camera with an APS-C sensor, you can multiply that by 1.6 to get 80 to 800mm, or 75 to 750mm if you use Nikon. Not many zoom lenses are that versatile, or zoom that far, especially for under £1,000. Sigma's lens designers really have some spirit and flair. I've had a good time putting this video together. The downside to that zoom range is that this lens's maximum aperture of f4.5 to 6.3 means it doesn't let in a lot of light to your camera. However, that's not so bad because this is the newer OS version of the lens, with image stabilization and improved optics, so don't get it mixed up with the older non-OS version. That image stabilization is a massive asset. Here's some footage at 500mm without stabilization, and here it is turned on. Considering we're at 500mm, it's doing a very good job of keeping your image still, which is a huge help to get sharper pictures and better video work. The stabilization is a little jerky as you pan the lens around though. The stabilization is useful even when you're shooting with a tripod. Even on quite a good tripod, and on only a slightly windy day, you'll get some shaky footage at 500mm. With image stabilization turned on, the effect of the wind is almost gone. Sigma have implemented their technology very well here, and it works very quietly too. Well, let's look at the build quality. Obviously, this lens is very big and it weighs about 2 kilos, so you can shoot handheld with it, but your arms will be aching afterwards. It has a lot of metal in its construction and it feels very tough and solid. No wonder some people like to call this the Bigma. The lens extends impressively far as you zoom in, and the zoom ring turns quite heavily, but also quite smoothly and evenly. The focus ring is just precise enough, and it's also very smooth to turn, and it works on a clutch, so you can safely turn it at any time. The HSM autofocus motor is pretty fast and also fairly quiet. Importantly, it worked quite accurately in my tests. The large front element is 95mm wide, so filters will be pretty expensive. But the front of the lens doesn't extend or rotate as you change focus. The lens comes with a nice case and a deep lens hood. So, along with the excellent image stabilization, this lens is basically built extremely nicely. It'd probably make quite a handy weapon if ever you needed. Anyway, let's look at the all-important image quality. Firstly, let's see how it performs on a full-frame camera, in this case a 20MP Canon 6D. We'll start at the widest angle, 50mm, and with the aperture wide open at f4.5. In the middle of the image, the picture is already extremely sharp with good contrast. The lens is just a little softer in the corners, and we can see some pink and green chromatic aberration. Stop the lens down to f8 for more sharpness and brightness. It's a good start. Let's zoom in to 100mm, where the maximum aperture is now f5. The picture quality in the middle remains excellent, and the corners are fairly good too, without too much colour fringing. Again, if you stop down to f8, there's more sharpness and brightness, and at f11, the lens reaches its peak performance, looking very sharp indeed. So far, so good. Let's zoom in to 300mm, where the maximum aperture is now f6.3. The middle of the image has deteriorated a bit, looking only averagely sharp, but it's still very usable picture quality. Happily though, the corners of the image are also looking okay, without much in the way of chromatic aberration. As usual, stop the lens down to f8 for more brightness and sharpness, and stop down to f11 for very good sharpness in those corners and excellent resolution in the middle. So the lens is still performing reasonably well. Finally, let's zoom in to 500mm. Even at f6.3, I'm pleased to say that the lens is still usably sharp in the middle of the image, although it's hardly bitingly sharp. The corners are a bit soft, with noticeable chromatic aberration, as you can see here in the window frames. At f8 there's a small improvement in the corners, but there's a major increase in sharpness in the middle of the image. At f11 the image quality is still fantastic in the middle, and quite usable in the corners of the image. I'm actually very impressed with this lens's picture quality. Even with its crazy 10 times zoom range ending in 500mm, this lens's optics are always very workable, and when you stop it down to f8, the lens is pretty sharp, even at 500mm. Alright, let's put the lens to work on a much harder playing field of a smaller sensor APS-C camera, in this case a 20 megapixel Canon 70D. At 50mm and f4.5, the sharpness levels are okay in the middle of the image, and also good enough in the corners. The lens doesn't really get any sharper when you stop down the aperture, even to f8, either in the corners or back in the middle. The picture quality is just good. At 100mm, it's the same story. We see averagely good resolution in the middle of the image, and the corners are just okay. There isn't much improvement stopped down, even to f11, either in those corners or in the middle. It's not bad at all, but not great. At 300mm and f6.3, the lens is a little soft in the middle of the image, and not particularly great over in the corners. Stop down to f8 for an improvement in those corners, and for much better sharpness in the middle of the image. Finally, at 500mm, the lens is still a bit soft in the middle of the image, and there's some notable ghosting and even chromatic aberration. The corners are even softer, although there's a tiny improvement when you stop the lens down to f8, and there's quite a major increase in sharpness right in the middle of the image. However, it doesn't seem to get any sharper than this, even when you stop the aperture down further. So, the tiny pixels in the sensor of an APS-C camera give this lens a bit of a headache. At wider angles, the lens always has good resolution, although it's never really razor sharp. When you zoom the lens in, especially to 500mm, you can only really get decent sharpness in the middle of the image, and if you stop the aperture down to f8. So the lens is usable on APS-C, but it's also a good example of how full-frame cameras tend to get more resolution out of lenses than APS-C cameras can. Alright, that took a while. Let's move on and look at distortion and vignetting. Obviously, this is a full-frame camera lens, and so they're not such a problem on a smaller sensor APS-C camera. On a full-frame camera though, the lens shows just a touch of barrel distortion at 50mm and some darkness in the corners, which brightens up when you stop down to f8. By the time you reach 100mm, we're looking at some light pincushion distortion. Zoomed in to 500mm, the pincushion distortion is heavier, but not a total disaster. However, the corners of the image really are quite dark. The vignetting is not quite so bad at f8, and it's under control when you stop down to f11. Overall, it's an okay performance for distortion, but those vignetting levels are a little strong. The lens's closest focus distance changes as you zoom in and out. For the closest focus distance and best available magnification, zoom in to 200mm, where you can focus as close as 60cm, which is actually very good. At f5.6, that close-up image quality is very sharp, and stop down to f8 for a further tiny improvement. A very good show. Let's see how the lens performs against bright lights. At wider angles, we lose a little contrast and see some flaring, but it's not completely ruinous. Zoom in a bit though, and you'll get more serious problems shooting against bright lights. Make sure you use that lens hood whenever you can. As you can see from this picture, the lens can give you quite out of focus backgrounds when you're zoomed in, and generally, the quality of its bokeh is very pleasing. Sometimes very complex backgrounds can look a little fussy, but by and large, there are no real problems here. Overall, this is a beast of a camera lens, and considering its huge telephoto zoom range, it put in quite a good performance in my tests. It can be surprisingly sharp, at least on a full-frame camera, and it has nice contrast levels and bokeh. The 50 to 500mm zoom range is tons of fun, extremely useful, especially for landscape or wildlife photography, and the lens's build quality and image stabilization are both excellent, so it's even a pleasure to use handheld, if you have strong arms. It's potentially useful for video work too. People who are using APS-C cameras might be disappointed by its lack of sharpness. But owners of full-frame cameras get a lot of picture quality for their money here, so to them, this is a very recommendable lens indeed, especially if you have a big enough camera bag. Good work, Sigma.